The United States has a full plate of commitments and simmering problems. So I think we're feeling a little strategically stretched. And I think the Chinese feel that economic growth and domestic problems require attention. So I think we may be at a moment where we each could take steps to, in effect, downplay problems externally so we can deal with problems that we face internally or closer in the case of Trump in the Western Hemisphere.
This is Steve Orlins, President of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, and I am thrilled to be joined by one of my predecessors, who is an old friend, Mike Lampton. Mike, as we all know, was president of the committee and has been at SAIS since that time. He is, of course, the author of Living U.S.-China Relations from Cold War to Cold War and many other wonderful books. But today, we're going to talk about an article which he wrote and appeared in Foreign Affairs. And we want to talk about it because I think it's so important, because we're at a seminal moment in U.S.-China relations, and Mike talks about it. It's called America and China at the Edge of Ruin, a last chance to step back from the brink. And in addition to Mike writing it, it's written by one of China's great America watchers, who's also an old friend, Wang Jisi. So my first question, I'm sure many of you haven't read it, so I urge you to read it, but in the interim, you can listen to Mike and he'll tell you somewhat what's in it. But first, Mike, talk about, when did the idea for this article come up?
Well, I first want to say that Wang Jisi, if he were here, would add a great deal, and we were both equal co-authors in this environment, and in any case, I wouldn't want to attribute everything I say in this program to Wang Jisi. There are probably a few things we might put differently if we were each individually writing, but I think it's really quite notable. This was one of the easier articles to write, certainly co-authored, because we agreed about so much. And so I think in this era where there's such an emphasis on what people in our respective societies think, I think it was notable that we could find great areas of commonality. So I want to thank Wang Jisi for cooperating together with me, but not attribute everything I say today to him. So with that understanding, the idea came, I went to China about 3 times in the last 7 months, and usually I try to see Wang Jisi, and I had just finished writing actually his biography for a book called Chinese Encounters with America, edited by Debbie Davis and Terry Lautz and put out by Columbia University Press. I had interviewed Wang Jisi and found out a lot about him. And I think the more we interacted, the more we found we had a lot in common. I remember we were talking and I said, "Aren't you terribly worried about the direction in which our relations are going? And don't you think much of it would benefit from thinking about the lessons of the past, the lessons of the last Cold War? And do you think we could write something that would take the experience of the past and try to distill it down to some hopeful ways we might contribute to a betterment of current relations?" So that was really the genesis of this. And Foreign Affairs was agreeable to that, and they expedited it, and it went through the process pretty fast.
Tell the audience the thrust of the article.
The basic thrust was that while we're not saying what we're in now between our two countries is a Cold War, it is certainly as many of the features of the first Cold War, and we learned a lot of lessons from that first Cold War, and we ought to use those lessons to mitigate the problems we have between our two countries going forward. And then we look now at the what we think is an opportunity in the next, say, 4 to 12 months to take some positive steps, and what might those positive steps be? So we want to avoid a Cold War. Here are the lessons. Here are the problems we face now. Here's what we recommend.
In the title, you use the word ruin and brink. What does that look like?
I'm not disassociating myself from the title. We had to approve, but we didn't generate it and we didn't have control over it. In fact, we had a different title, and I won't go into it. But I think it does accurately convey the degree of alarm we have. That is to say, I don't think most people realize the degree to which we're in a serious arms and security race with China. And one of the major features of the first Cold War was a technological arms race with the Soviet Union. And when you're in that kind of arms race, then you are driven to a policy of deterrence. And what deterrence is threat. And both sides begin to discourage the other from doing things they don't want the other side to do by making threat. And you get on a stair-step kind of process of technological possibility, driving new weapon systems, driving defense against those, and you step your way into a situation in which you're more and more insecure at ever greater cost. And eventually, you're either going to have an accident, you're going to have a mistake, or you're going to drive each other into economic distress at least.
Should we be in this Cold War?
It's explainable. Speaking normatively, should we be? I think it'll be a tragedy for not only the United States and China, but the rest of the world. So if we're speaking normatively, this is a highly undesirable future we're heading towards.
How much of this is driven by ideology?
It varies from administration to administration. I mean, just take the last two. And we also have to talk about Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. But as far as the Biden administration was concerned, they defined the current era as a struggle between autocracy and democracy. And you may remember at the very beginning of the Biden administration, they had a sentiment of democracies. And of course, China wasn't invited, but even countries like Singapore weren't. So I would say there was a heavy component of ideology, if you define it as conflict derivative of system type, democracy, autocracy, and so on. So if you ask what's the ideological drive in China, and I'm not speaking for Wang Jisi, I would say at the current time, it's not so much ideology, it's just simply the perception that the United States no longer has an interest, as it used to say it had, in the economic development and increasing strength, really, of China for many decades, or at least 2 or 3 decades. Our slot phrase was, we have an interest in the growth and development of China. We usually also said peaceful development and other things. So to my sense, the Chinese aren't so ideological. They are more, I think, just simply big power competition and their own development.
Did the United States make a mistake at the beginning of the Biden administration? During the campaign, I expected that Biden would reverse a lot of the Trump administration's policies. Not only did they not reverse them, they intensified them, much to my surprise. Now, of course, we're in the position where President Trump is reversing those policies. But was that a mistake at the beginning of the Biden administration?
There were lots of Biden administration policies, and some were more well advised than others. I thought, environmental policy and so on, there was much to commend what the Biden administration did. But the basic thrust of your question is, didn't I expect harder turn away from Trump-like policies when Biden came in? And the answer is yes, I did expect that. And yes, they didn't do as much as I would have thought. And I was particularly disappointed by the trade policies. I thought they should have moved off the tariffs almost as fast as they could. And also, it's complicated. Supply chain and technology and export controls are complicated. And you need to know a lot about the technology to have firm opinions. But my general view is that export controls, while the Biden administration said they were going to build what they called high fences around a small yard, meaning they'd only protect a few key technologies. That, first of all, that's not so easy to do. and small yards and high fences become big yards and higher fences.
Now, you said this was an easy article to write because you and Jisa agreed on most of the things. What didn't you agree on?
First of all, we each responded to each other's drafts, so we could see, and we weren't trying to find areas of disagreement. I think the philosophy that we used was the way of interlocutors, I think, to successfully deal with each other is to imagine that you and your interlocutor are on one side of the table, and the problem that you face is on the other side of the table. And so you have a discussion about what's the problem. And you don't start out with a bunch of accusations. You say, what's the problem here? And then what are the alternatives we could face? And so I think we both put ourselves in a posture of trying to address a common set of problems. And we didn't have enormous disagreements. You'll note there's not a lot in there about human rights explicitly. I think, absence of war is a human right. Economic development is a human right. So I don't mean it doesn't have any human rights content, but we didn't talk explicitly about that and rule of law and so forth, because we thought there wasn't much we could contribute to that conversation at this moment. So I wouldn't say disagreement. There were more areas where we just said the opportunity to reach consensus is considerably less in some areas than others.
It's funny, when I first saw the article and it said a last chance to step back from the brink.
Yeah.
What I thought the article was going to talk about, and it talks about it slightly, but I thought you meant Donald Trump was our last chance to step back from the brink.
Uh-huh.
He is the first president since Jimmy Carter to basically be willing to tell people this is in America's interest. This is in the interest of the American people. You guys have your own vested interest, but I'm not going to listen to them. I'm going to do what I want to do. But that you kind of slightly touch on that. But do you think that's true?
I think this comes up actually in the whole discussion of Taiwan. You would say in the American political milieu, as we've pretty much defined it, I would say you said Jimmy Carter, that's one, and probably President George W. Bush. So I think since Carter and George W. Bush in that respect, there's been a kind of chipping away at the norms and practices that had been developed since normalization to deal with Taiwan. And I think Trump seems to be more in, I'm going to do with respect to this area what are in our interests. And he has a broader definition of interest that's highly dominated by trade. So I think in some sense, what I'm worried about there is that he may be encouraging, on the one hand, the Chinese to think he's not very committed to Taiwan. And the more he convinces, he creates problems in Taiwan about them reacting to the lack of support. So I think the Taiwan thing is where he is a little off the main trend in the past. That isn't to say he's wrong, but it is to say it seems to me that's where he's off track.
What do you think he really can accomplish realistically?
Well, I think what he needs to do is, I think we are both at a moment, meaning the U.S. and China, where we both have enormous numbers of problems internally. The United States has, in addition, a full plate of commitments and simmering problems. Venezuela, Iran, Ukraine, Taiwan, Cuba, Gaza, North Korea. So I think we're feeling a little strategically stretched. And I think the Chinese feel that economic growth and domestic problems require attention. So I think we may be at a moment where we each could take steps to, in effect, downplay problems externally so we can deal with problems that we face internally, or closer in the case of Trump in the Western Hemisphere.
Underlying the whole concept of strategic competitor is Taiwan. All of the other issues, which supposedly are strategic competition, emanate from the Taiwan issue. So if you could kind of put that aside, then you could more easily resolve trade, investment, technology, AI, Ukraine, all the issues which you listed.
I think we can reassure China that we don't stand for the separation. And I think the last 2 decades, we've chipped away at the confidence that the Chinese have about our commitment to the one China idea. On the other hand, as we point out, this arms race is a lot bigger than just the Taiwan Straits. It now has to do with information and cyber, and there have been great thefts of data sets from the Office of Personnel Management and Social Security numbers and so forth. So I think there's a technological race, which is also part of an economic race for dominance of the technologies of the future. I think that's for sure. Also, we have a space race. I mean, just look at the T-shirt that Elon Musk wears, Occupy Mars, right? This is no joke where we're headed in space and so on. So unfortunately, Taiwan's not the only problem of a strategic character.
It emanates from Taiwan. If the Taiwan issue did not exist, many would conclude that the benefits of cooperation far outweigh the benefits of confrontation, because there is no circumstance in which the U.S. and China could be at war with each other because of the Taiwan issue. So why did they hack? Because they're worried about what we will ultimately call for the independence of Taiwan. The technology, I think it was Harry Harding who 20 years ago, in a lecture at our foreign policy colloquium for GW, said, political competition, it's okay. We have political competition with everybody. Economic competition, we compete with Canada, with the EU, with Japan, with South Korea. That's okay. Strategic competition is really dangerous, because when you define somebody as a strategic competitor, you spend, now in the United States case, you spend $1 trillion to defend against that contingency. And that is extremely damaging. What I worry about is we're already losing this war by directing $1 trillion to defense. I mean, I always joke, I ride the New York subways every day. I take Amtrak down to Washington. It is a disaster beyond comprehension. The New York subways, it used to be once every 5. Now it's 2 out of every 5 they break down. The Chinese could fix this with a signaling system that's 21st century, but they can't because of, quote, national security. So lower income Americans are paying the price for this strategic competition, but that's a whole different.
Well, it does point to one thing, and that is, I think we need a serious strategic, meaning military, and how we conceive of the global security. And one of the things that's occurring is we have the breakdown in the strategic arm limitation talks, the intermediate force missile talks, and so forth. And I think the Chinese and we need to talk about force levels and how can we get them at the absolute lowest level. And I think I agree with you that if we could get more reassurance on Taiwan and get back to more cross-strait trade and tourism and human interaction and so forth, that would all be good. All I'm simply saying is I think if at this point, even if we really found a durable, confidence-inducing way to create confidence about the Taiwan issue, I think we'd still have problems. That's all I'm saying. But I'm a great supporter of the idea. I mean, I did a book on China building high-speed rail. I think we ought to be cooperating. I think
it's a great
there's
book.
a project in BRI that's in our interest and we can make some money. I think we ought to do it. So I'm sympathetic to the spirit, but sometimes when you change the situation, there's no going back.
Well, what we see is President Trump is willing to do this in a lot of areas, whether we like it or not. We're 6 weeks away from President Trump visiting China. Talk about suggestions for what his agenda should be with the Chinese government, with Xi Jinping.
Well, I think there are several we make, and I think we're both that would be committed to them. First of all, is that we reopen the two consulates that were closed down in mid 2020 in Houston and in Chengdu. If somebody wants to suggest some other consulates in some other cities, maybe. But the point is, I think we ought to maximize our diplomatic interaction and have as much presence in each other's country as possible. And I think that ought to be easy. Now, I've heard our government give some reasons why they are reluctant to do that. I won't go into it, but I will say it was, to me, not compelling. So I think, opening two consulates, while not as simple as that statement would suggest, ought to be relatively easy. And it would facilitate travel and say we're both open for business in a way. So I think that's certainly one thing that we ought to be trying to do. I've already mentioned that we ought to renew, and in fact, at Busan in the fall, the summit between Xi Jinping and Trump, they agreed on, I'll say, restarting or re-energizing military to military talks. I think we ought to do that and focus on missiles and missile defense would be one area. Also, the proliferation danger. If there's proliferation in Asia, it's going to be a bigger problem for China than us, or arguably so, because there's going to be Japan and Korea. India then will react even more by building up Pakistan. I mean, in terms of nuclear proliferation, Asia is really a can of worms. So I think we ought to move on that. Certainly media and students. We're each now in our own way and our own vocabulary calling into question whether researchers and scholars and media are legitimate undertakings or part of an espionage effort that each is carrying on. So I think we ought to get ourselves back to a much better situation in terms of media presence, particularly the United States and China, and scholars. And also the U.S. dropped in 24-25 the number of F1 visas it was issuing by over 25%. So I think that would be certainly something we can do. I think the tariff thing is so messed up now, given what the Supreme Court has done and how President Trump's reacted. They've gone from 10% universal to 15%. So it's hard to say, but in our paper, we say we really ought to reduce the across the board tariffs to the lowest possible level, and they ought to be based on reciprocity. The main point is we need to do something on tariffs. But frankly, and this isn't a partisan statement, I think you'll hear as many Republicans and independents say it as me, unpredictability has become its own obstacle. So I'm not sure, frankly, at this point, what the Chinese would do given the volatility of our own position day to day. But anyway, I think we ought to try to do something in the tariff area.
You think the Chinese would be willing to do anything on Facebook, YouTube, Google, Twitter, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal?
Well, all those are different things. I'm not sure there is the print
media. They're all blocked in China.
Yeah, no,
they are different things.
Same problem. But I mean, the problem to the Chinese, I think the online world may be a more severe problem for them than the print world. Let's put it that way, if that's not too odd. But in any case, yes, I think they should. And I don't know that we didn't mention that explicitly. We just said more media reciprocity and expand the presence. Google and social media, seems to me, though, the degree which they have followers, it triggers a kind of the fear of China of interactive political activity abroad in a way that the more traditional media don't. But I would be, yes, it's not a compelling story to have America penetrable by Chinese social media and the United States can't step a toe into China. That's not a stable policy from an American point of view.
You've been a leader in training next generation scholars. If I had a buck for every time I meet somebody who told me I studied with Mike Lampton, I'd have much more money. It would be great. Why did you and Jisa, not reach out to two younger scholars to co-author this?
Well, it may not be a compelling answer, but it's the truth. We didn't think of it. And so, you know, that may well just be the end of the answer. But that would have been a good idea. And it's no less a good idea in the future. And I would encourage generations younger than us to take the initiative and do joint projects. I've always said, in a way, the Chinese that I've talked to and interacted with over the years are my teachers, right? There seems to be less opportunity, and this isn't just the Americans' fault. China has now a whole set of restrictions that limit cooperative activity between Chinese and American intellectuals. So it's not all the U.S. fault. But I would encourage younger people to do more cooperative work to the degree they can with their Chinese colleagues. But certainly cross generationally, us we'll say old timers would be glad to cooperate with younger people.
Do you think that younger scholars and kind of older scholars represented by you, me, have different views of U.S. China relations and what has caused this and where it's going? And if so, what should we do?
I don't know. I don't find fixing blame for historical processes all that useful, to tell you the truth. Because then rather than solving the problem, it's trying to pin blame on somebody for the problem. Now, I don't mean to deny that some things are egregious in history were pretty clearly caused, but most historical processes are multi-factor, and it's so wound up with perceptions, and perceptions are so wound up with history that I find it more useful, as I said, to say, what do we think the problem is? And what are the ways in which we could move towards making it less of a problem? And I think that's a much better framework than pointing your finger and saying, why did you start this? And now what are you going to do? The Chinese phrase is, you lifted a stone to drop it on your feet.
This wasn't a pinning blame question. It was, is there a difference in views of younger scholars and older scholars like us?
I don't know that it breaks down generationally. As from my experiences, I see a cross section of the views that many of the older people had variation, and I see much of the same variation. I think the use of online and data and what different generations accept as good or bad information. Maybe there's some variation more in the methodological and how do you understand. But I don't think, in terms of policy prescriptions, I see the older generation as just by definition different along some line than another.
I think that's one probably Jisa would say there is a difference between the older generation and the younger generation. They would ask me, so where is the next Mike Lampton? So who's going to speak out on these issues? It seems to be a continuing search in China for the next generation of scholars who really understand and have lived in China for many, many years. But yeah, I can see both sides.
Well, I just to say on that, I mean, different generations had different environments in which they were moving ahead, in their profession. And during much of my career, interacting at ever and ever deeper levels with China and spending more and more time there was a positive career strategy. So, I was trying to survive as a young person, and that was the set of opportunities I had. Now people are trying to survive in a domestic environment, much more security oriented, much different methodologically, data and so forth. So I think it isn't necessarily that the younger generation disagrees on some fundamental level, but they've been exposed to different opportunities and they have different career risks. So that I do see. I don't think it would be so easy to develop for a young person just coming into the field a strategy of I'm going to spend my career talking to Chinese leaders at the Politburo level and up. That's just not going to happen. And it did happen to some of my generation.
Yeah, yeah. When I lived in Beijing, used to be a lot easier to see a Politburo member.
Yeah.
We have gone way beyond the article, which is American China at the Edge of Ruin. If you haven't read it, go read it. But this conversation has been fascinating as always. We can't thank you enough, Mike, for everything that you do.
Well, thank you, Steve, and best to the committee.